Howdy, and welcome to Wise About Golf, the Texas Golf History Podcast. This is your host, Ken Wise. Thank you so much for tuning in today for a little bit of Texas golf history. This is episode 4 of this brand new podcast. And if you are new to Wise About Golf, you may not know that I've been podcasting for over a decade on the podcast Wise About Texas, which covers Texas history broadly. And I started this podcast not even 2 weeks ago, as of the date this episode is being released. And I tell you that to tell you this. I'm releasing these early episodes in fairly quick succession so that we have a bit of a body of work for new people that are tuning in. So if you're tuning in to this episode fresh, you are hearing the 4th episode being released within the last 10 days. The first one, of course, was an introduction, if you've already heard that, to what this podcast is doing. The second covered the earliest golf in Texas. The third, Galveston Country Club. And now we come to episode 4, which is going to cover the person whom I'm calling the first golf pro in Texas. And you are joining several hundred other listeners as of the date of the release of this podcast. Again, less than 14 days after the release of the first one, we've already got several hundred people listening to this podcast. So I guess it was a pretty decent idea. This episode is going to relate back to episode 3, Galveston Country Club, in one important facet, and that is that this first pro that I'm going to talk about was the person that laid out the holes for Galveston Country Club and was its first golf professional, if only for a brief time. A couple of notes for this episode. First of all, if you enjoy this Texas golf history, please leave a 5-star review for this podcast. That'll help other people find the show. Also, in the introduction episode, I talked about the idea that to qualify as Texas golf history, I really needed only to find the thinnest of connections to Texas that might launch us into some more general golf history that would tie to the subject of the episode. And this is going to be one of those connection to Texas episodes because this individual that I'm going to talk about, whose name is Mungo Park Jr., actually, was only in Texas for a brief time, but his history goes back hundreds of years in Scotland to the very origins of the game. So this will be the first of what I anticipate to be many episodes that will place Texas golf history into the larger context of golf history around the world, which is very interesting, and I hope you agree. So let's get right into it. We are going to go back as far as the 17th century, the 1600s, and get wise about golf. The subject of our episode today is a gentleman named Mungo Park, and we're going to call him Mungo Park Jr. That's an interesting name. We're going to talk about that name in a minute. Mungo Park was born in Musselburgh. Now, I've had several Scottish friends, including one of my best friends who was from Musselburgh, and I got a lesson one night. There may have been some wine involved. A very specific lesson about how to pronounce the name. The name is spelled Musselburgh, but the Burgh is pronounced bruh. So it's Musselburgh. And Musselburgh is, the golf course in Musselburgh is one of the oldest golf courses anywhere in the world. They've documented golf back to 1672. The Guinness Book of World Records certifies it as the oldest golf course in the world. Mary Queen of Scots is said to have played there. Mary Queen of Scots, born in 1542, raised in France. She was her second husband was named Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. He was found dead in 1567 in the garden of a house in Edinburgh, Scotland. And she quickly married the Earl of Bothwell, probably pronounced Bothwell. And that lord was suspected of the murder. She ended up having to flee to England and being imprisoned and being executed. But they gathered some charges against her, and one of the charges was that she was seen playing golf shortly after her husband's murder in Musselburgh. Now, the fact of the matter is, the evidence on that is pretty thin. She probably wasn't actually playing golf. But what's important about that is that she could have been, and that was one of the charges that they brought against her, that rather than mourning the death of her husband, she was playing golf in Musselburgh. So obviously she must have been guilty. But, it's interesting that golf was so popular even back then that they would use it as a tool because the people would believe that it was plausible that the Queen was actually playing golf at that time. Let me go back even before Musselburgh and talk about Leith. In Leith, in 1744, there was a golf club formed called the Gentlemen Golfers of Edinburgh. Leith was the port for Edinburgh, and it was east of town. It was a very busy port. It was Scotland's really window to the world. They traded, all the trade goods came in from Leith, and there was links land there near the port, and golf was played there in the 1700s. I mentioned this in one of the prior episodes, but links land in Scotland was land that was the shoreline and back. It was sort of a raised beach area, sandy, it drained pretty well. It wasn't very useful for farming. It really wasn't very useful for anything. It was considered owned by the public, and the public would do anything the public would want to do in a park, including grazing some animals. They would do their wash. The militia would drill there. The archers would practice. And people that wanted to play games involving hitting balls with a stick found that links land to be fairly useful. And that would be golf. So there were men who formed that Gentlemen Golfers Club. And these men, it's important to know, were lawyers, doctors, merchants, bankers, officials from Edinburgh. These were people with time on their hands. They could take an afternoon off. They had enough income to buy the equipment to make a few bets. One of the first competitions that was held by this club at Leith was won by a surgeon named John Rattray. And when he won, he was dubbed the captain of the golf, which is what they called the club champion back then. And that was being played on the Leith links. The golfers petitioned the city of Edinburgh for a trophy, and the city commissioned the fashioning of a silver club that the golfers competed for, which demonstrates, I think, that the citizens that were playing golf at this time were fairly prominent. And one of the most interesting parts of these Leith links golfers in their story is that they made the first rules of golf. And these, the original, people knew that these rules existed, but they never found the original until 1937. There was an original found. It was written on the last 2 pages in the back of a minute book that the Honorable Company had kept. And John Rattray had actually signed the bottom of these rules. And I'm not going to read all the rules, but a couple of the rules just for you golfers out there are pretty interesting. Rule number 1, you must tee your ball within a club length of the hole, which certainly would have slowed down play a little bit. Another interesting one reads, quote, "You are not to remove stones, bones, or any break club," close quote. So anything that would break your club. And I suppose if you ran into a skeleton, you just played your ball where it lies. They made a rule about removing your ball from the water and taking a penalty stroke. One interesting rule, this is actually Rule 10, if a ball be stopped by any person, horse, dog, or anything else, the ball must be played where it lies. So be careful, don't hit a horse with your golf ball. And then Rule 13 is pretty interesting. Neither trench, ditch, or dike made for the preservation of the links, nor the scholars' holes or the soldiers' lines shall be accounted a hazard. So they invented the free drop. So Rattray signed these as captain of the golf. And then the rules were amended 1758. So 14 years later, there's a note on the same document that shows an amendment to the rules. So there were already rules disputes in those early 1700 rules. This club built a clubhouse. They had met in a tavern for many years. The tavern was named Lucky Cleefans, and Lucky Cleefans, they finally built a house. They called it the Golf House, and the club met there. And in a minute, I want to talk about the British club system, but we're headed to Musselburgh. And the club fell into hard times in the early 1800s, 1830s. And finally, in July 1836, the club reconstituted itself and moved to Musselburgh. Leith had grown, and the links had grown, and the golfers were competing with other uses of the land in addition to the financial trouble in which they found themselves. So they needed to move to Musselburgh. Now, they were already playing golf in Musselburgh, so the club picks up and says, we're just going to go over here where we're not going to be as interfered with. Musselburgh at that time had, depending on which account you read, 7 or 8 holes, and the holes were laid out inside the horse racing track, which, if you think about it, makes sense. And by the way, if you watch auto racing in Indianapolis Motor Speedway, there's an 18-hole golf course on the property. 9 of the holes are inside the racetrack at Indianapolis. So this is not an unusual occurrence. So they moved to Musselburgh and reconstitute the club. Golf had been played in Musselburgh since the late 1600s. And by 1870, finally had 9 holes. At the 4th hole, there was an inn called Mrs. Foreman's. The inn had a hatch in the wall, conveniently big enough to pass drinks to the golfers. And that's where the Honorable Company set up shop. So here we are in 1836. In 1836, of course, Texas was fighting and winning her independence. So as the Honorable Company moves to Musselburgh, the Alamo fell, the Goliad Massacre occurred, the Battle of San Jacinto occurred, and Texas is free. The original Mungo Park, at least original for our purposes, was also born in 1836 in Musselburgh. He was the fourth of 9 children, of a man who named James Park, who was a plowman. He would go on to win the Open Championship, the British Open, in 1874. Let me mention something, by the way. This episode's being released in early August 2026, and every year in the summer during golf's major season, we always argue, at least in America, about whether to call it the British Open or the Open Championship. The Open Championship would prefer us to use that terminology, but the Open Championship itself used to call itself the British Open, and you can see, if you will do a little searching, you will see old medals that say winner of the British Open. All right, enough about that. Mungo Park is brothers with a gentleman named Willie Park Sr. So let's talk about the Park family for a minute. Willie Park Sr. won the first British Open / Open Championship in 1860. He would go on to win 4 more. The Mungo Park we're talking about, born in 1836, would win the Open Championship in 1874. The Park family would go on to become one of the founding families of golf. And they are considered today the most prominent family of the Musselburgh group. There was more than one golf club at Musselburgh, however. Other golf clubs came to play. One was the Royal Musselburgh Club, the Royal Burgess Golfing Society, the Brunsfield Links Golfing Society. These are 1700s and 1800s clubs. They each had a clubhouse and were all sharing the links at Musselburgh, which reminds me to mention the British club system is a little bit different than the American club system. If you're listening to this in the United States, it's going to start getting confusing when you say all these golf clubs shared the links. But remember, the links was common ground. It was public ground, and the course that was laid out over the links would be shared by anybody. It was a public golf course. So these clubs would form, And they didn't own the course. They just had rights to access the course. In America, our society, we founded country clubs which would build their golf courses. So you would form a club, you would buy land as a club to which you would then have exclusive access, and you would build your own golf course. So when we talk about a golf club, we're talking about a place that owns its own golfing ground, so to speak. In the UK, what you have are clubs that share access to the links. And so this is the culture the parks are working in. One other interesting thing about Musselburgh, that one of the clubs, I think it was Royal Musselburgh, if memory serves, bought a hole cutter, had a local blacksmith make a hole cutter so they could cut the holes in the ground, and it just so happened to be 4 1/4 inches across. So that is the thinking of how the standard golf hole, 4 1/4 inches, which it is today, hundreds of years later, came to be there in Musselburgh. Well, golf continued to grow, and the Honorable Company moved on to a new golfing ground called Muirfield, which still exists today, is one of the British Open sites. There I said it, the British Open. The club itself continues to exist. So back to the parks, we had Willie Park, who I mentioned won the Open Championship 4 times. His brother Mungo would win it in 1874. And here's where it starts to get a little bit confusing. Willie had a son whom he named after his brother Mungo. And that's who we talk about as Mungo Park Jr. He's not a junior as we think about it because his father was Willie, but he was called Junior. So he was born in 1877. By this time, the Parks were well known as a golfing family. Oh, let me mention something about the name Mungo while we're on the subject. There is a Saint Mungo. He was a missionary in the 6th century, and it was the founder and patron saint of Glasgow, Scotland. So it's a popular Scottish name. There was an explorer named Mungo Park who was born in 1771. He made 2 expeditions into West Africa. He was searching for the headwaters of the Niger River and was a prominent national figure. He died on one of those expeditions. So the Mungo name in the Park family came from either the explorer or the saint or both. So we have now Willie Park, the Open champion, Mungo Park, his brother, the Open champion. Now we have Mungo Park Jr., Willie's son. While the Parks were on the rise in Musselburgh, golf was also being played at St. Andrews, a place which many listeners might even be more familiar with. And there was a prominent family there, the Morris family. We had old Tom Morris, who was a golf ball maker, and his son, young Tom Morris. And St. Andrews was on the rise as a prominent golf center. Now, I'm going to talk more about the Morrises. I'm going to have to work a little harder to find some connections to Texas, but don't you worry. I'm going to find them. So just let me spend a moment on them. Back when old Tom Morris learned to make golf balls, they were playing with a type of ball called a feathery, which was a round leather pouch packed with feathers. It was a handcrafted item. It was very valuable. It was expensive and hard to make. And there was a man in St. Andrews named Alan Robertson. They called him the King of Clubs, and old Tom Morris was his apprentice. And they actually got into a fight when Tom Morris was caught playing with one of the newfangled gutta percha balls, the first rubber golf ball, and Robertson fired him. But anyway, old Tom was a very prominent citizen in St. Andrews. He had gone to Prestwick to be the keeper of the greens, came back to St. Andrews. His son was kind of the first golf prodigy, won the British Open 3 times, got to keep the trophy, which was a red leather belt, which you can see in a museum in St. Andrews. This feud, actually, as golf feuds tend to do, ended up in a challenge. Willie Park Sr., who had yet to win a British Open, this was 1854, put an ad in the newspaper, challenged the St. Andrews men, Alan Robertson, old Tom Morris, and a guy named Willie Dunn, to playing for 100 pounds a side. Now, 100 pounds in 1854, I mean, that must be thousands today. None of the three accepted the challenge, but Old Tom's brother George did and said he'd play him. Well, Willie Park just thrashed George. Several other matches occurred, including one in 1870 where they had a match for 100 pounds that was played over 4 golf courses. Now, the prize for the Open, this is 1856, they played over Musselburgh, Prestwick, North Berwick, and St. Andrews for 100 pounds. The British Open prize was not even 8 pounds at this time. And that was the match that Park won. They also had a match in 1870 where they played over 4 courses. And the last leg was in Musselburgh, which was Park's home course. And the crowd was so partisan and so unruly that they actually had to stop playing. Willie Park said, "No way, we're not going to stop playing." Of course, the crowd was in Willie Park's favor. And he said the referee doesn't have the authority to do this. So he went back out and played the last 6 holes and played alone. The next day he said, "No, I'm not playing because you didn't have the authority to stop the match." And the referee said, "Well, okay, Old Tom Morris from St. Andrews, you go out and play," which he did. And then he declared Old Tom the winner. So the feud between Musselburgh and St. Andrews was pretty serious. I'll wrap up that feud with this. In 1875, the 2 Park brothers, Willie and Mungo, played the Morrises, Old Tom and Young Tom, in North Berwick, which is not too terribly far from St. Andrews. The Morrises won. They won that match by a hole. Unfortunately, as they came off the course, Young Tom learned that his wife was in a very difficult labor, and by the time he got back to St. Andrews, she had passed, and that really sort of ruined Young Tom's life, and he would die very young. So it was a sad ending to that tale. But the feud about where the home of golf was is real, and I mentioned having a good Scottish friend from Musselburgh, and believe me, that feud still exists in the 21st century. So into this whole scene, that's the whole scene that Mungo Park Jr. would have grown up in. And by the time he was born, we were in deep into the golf business with the Park family. In fact, in 1897, when Mungo would have been our Mungo, I'm calling him our Mungo, Mungo Park Jr., would have been turning 20, the Park family golf enterprise had opened a branch in New York. So it had come to America. If you go back and listen to episode 1, we talk about the first golf club in America, the St. Andrews Golf Club in New York. The Parks, Willie Park had opened an office in New York because golf was taking North America by storm. And he decided to send his nephew, Mungo Jr., to run it. So he comes over and runs the New York office for a little while, fairly short while. And in that time, he began laying out golf courses for folks in the Northeast. He laid out a 9-hole course called the Duchess Golf Club in Poughkeepsie. He began working as a professional at the Diker Meadow Club, which was located in Brooklyn. And the people that were playing golf in North America at the time was sort of the upper crust. Remember, this is the Gilded Age. So these were folks this was the first kind of American royalty, which I know is a bit of an oxymoron, but they really were seeking exclusive societal structures and status and pastimes, and they viewed golf correctly as a British game, and they wanted from the upper crust, and they wanted to play this British game. And so that's who the Parks were working for. So the folks in Galveston found Mungo Park Jr. I have searched and searched. It's very difficult to make a direct connection. I'm still searching, and you can bet you'll hear about it if I find it. The connection that reveals exactly how Mungo Park Jr. was brought to Galveston. But Galveston, as I mentioned in the last episode number 3, was the Queen City of the South. It was the largest city in Texas. It was one of the most prosperous cities in the South, if not the most prosperous city. And it stands to reason that they would seek out the best golf course designer they could find, and they found Mungo Park Jr. So he comes down to Galveston to lay out the golf course. Again, from last episode, he laid it out on the beach about at 53rd Street. He would have had plenty of open land. The land would have looked familiar to him. It would have been, it's probably our equivalent of links land. If you talk about Galveston Island back then, you tend to talk about it being a sandbar or a barrier island. Those are the terms that we use here in America. It's about as close to links as we're going to get. And in modern golf terminology, you talk about links as more of a style than a land, but that's not really what it is. Links in Scotland is actually a type of land. And so Galveston Island would have looked very familiar to him. And he lays out the golf course, and he serves as the golf professional in Galveston. And the Galveston Country Club is very successful. And golf begins to get popular in Texas. And they would have learned to play it in the Scottish style, so to speak, from one of the most prominent Scottish golfers in the world, and certainly one of the most prominent in the United States. Mungo was not the only Scottish golf professional. Most of the golf professionals coming to America were from Scotland, and he was not even the only Scotsman in Texas. We'll save that for some later episodes, but the Americans in Galveston would have been learning the game as it was played in Scotland in the late 1800s. So Mungo Park Jr.'s resume includes the Duchess Golf Club in Poughkeepsie, New York, Diker Beach in Brooklyn that I mentioned, a club in Vermont, in Bennington, Vermont, named Mount Anthony, the original Galveston Country Club, St. Johnsbury's Country Club, also in Vermont, another place called the Mohawk Mountain House in New Paltz, New York, and Mungo would then go on to be a golf pioneer in South America. Golf started to become popular in Argentina, so he moved to Argentina in the early 20th century. And the first Argentine Open was 1905, and Mungo Park Jr. won that. He also won it in 1907 and 1912. He would go back to Scotland and marry his wife, Grace. Grace would become the first ladies Argentine Open champion. They would return to Scotland eventually, where Mungo Park Jr. would pass away in 1960, having lived a full and rich life in the game of golf and designing and staffing the very first country club in the state of Texas. Well, that wraps it up for this episode of Wise About Golf. Thank you very much for listening. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Facebook at Wise About Golf, Twitter at Wise About Golf TX. If you like what you're hearing, go and leave a 5-star review for the podcast. That'll help other golfers find the show. And send me your ideas for Texas golf history. As you've learned, certainly with this episode, it doesn't take much to connect great golf history to Texas. Email me your ideas, golf@wiseabouttexas.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, hit 'em straight, and we'll see you down the road.